Welcome to another edition of the Mail Time Podcast. I want to spend today discussing one of the speeches from Rabbi Angela Buchdahl of Central Synagogue. I want to first preface this by saying a few things. One, I actually went to a pluralistic Jewish day school or Jewish high school. I understand what many of the people in the Reform movement believe. That's not to say I understand everyone or every single nuance of every subject. Same would go with any other religious group. Second of all, I have deep theological differences with the Reform movement, but that's not at all part of the criticism here. Third, I understand that Angela Buchdahl is of Korean heritage. I frankly don't care. I don't care if she has Mexican heritage, Japanese heritage, Korean heritage, British heritage. It really does not matter. I'm only interested in the ideas. In the run-up to the mayoral election in New York City, Central Synagogue issued a statement under Angela Buchdahl's name saying that they don't get involved in politics and that they don't endorse candidates. Now, it's a little bit of a straw man because what was really asked in the statement that over 1,000 Jewish leaders signed was actually condemning the anti-Semitism and the anti-Zionism of Zohran Mamdani. Not even asking for an endorsement of Andrew Cuomo or Curtis Sliwa or anything like that. But she could have first get out on the bima and condemn the anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism. And as you'll see here, the claim that there's no politics is nonsense. And one of the issues that the Reform movement struggles with is when you have such a political bend to much of what you define as Judaism, you are inviting controversies like this. When you go to a modern Orthodox synagogue, there is more to the service, or actually service is something you do to your car, but there's more to prayer than simply what your view is on the current Israeli government. Yeah, the rabbi might have an opinion and might say something in a way that challenges your moral viewpoint. But that's not the essence of what Judaism is. And what we see here in many of the speeches, and I've gone through many of Angela Buchdahl's speeches, is this conflation of politics and core religious beliefs, which I believe is extremely dangerous and creates this very weird situation in which she's more outspoken about what she perceives as threats in Israel than she is about domestic issues that are right in front of New York's collective face. So I want to just run the speech and I'll comment as necessary. I also want to note that I'm not going to comment on every single theological disagreement that I might have, because that's not the point of this podcast. She might say a few things here. I know she says a few things here that I don't think are in line with traditional Jewish thinking, but I'm not here to critique every single Devar Torah. That's not the issue.
Years ago, this week, Israel's Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin and PLO President Yasser Arafat signed the Oslo Accords. I watched sworn enemies shaking hands on the White House lawn, and I was sure that peace was just around the corner. Back then, it was a lot simpler for a young American Jew to call herself a Zionist.
Okay, first, let's just start here. Why was it more simple to call yourself a Zionist? Because Yitzhak Rabin shook hands with a terrorist, Yasser Arafat. I don't actually understand why it would be much more simple then. Then there was the concept of doing that was completely insane. Now we've normalized shaking hands with terrorists for good or for bad, right? Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner sat down with Hamas in Egypt. So I actually don't know why it's much simpler to be a Zionist. around the Oslo Accords, I'm not sure that's actually historically accurate.
Back then, it felt like Jews everywhere agreed that a two-state solution was viable.
In the echo chamber, of course there was dissent. Of course it was controversial. It wasn't saying, oh, every single person out there said that you have to do the Oslo Accords. That's just a historical fiction.
But by the time I arrived in Israel for rabbinical school, just 20 months later, that optimism was already unraveling. I will never forget the November night when I heard that Rabin was assassinated at a peace rally. Adding to the shock, his murderer was a fellow Israeli, a religious zealot, some called a hero. We poured onto the streets of Jerusalem.
Of course, you're going to have some extremists and lunatics that call him a hero. So the technical word would be, yes, some, but to say that's a mainstream thinking is crazy. Now, she didn't say mainstream, she said some, but the implication is that it's more than several thousand even whack jobs. Now, I'm not... these are kind of the semantic tricks that are being played. I also just want to clarify, this is from September of 2023, just to keep that in mind, right before the October 7th attacks.
Jerusalem joining dazed and distraught Israelis who held signs that read, Busha, shame. For the first time, I understood that one of the greatest threats to Israel's survival was the extremism within our own people. Over the next...
So you have a murderer, someone who broke Israeli law, who's convicted and will never see a day of freedom ever again. And you have a couple of insane people that supported him. And that's now one of the greatest threats to the Jewish people. Again, you see how perverse this is. This isn't to say that religious extremism in that way, if you're going to act in the way of murdering people, that isn't a problem. Of course, that's a problem. But to paint it as if you have the religious extremism, so you basically have the shtachim, you have settlements, and that's the religious extremist, and that's one of the greatest threats to Israel. Keep in mind that 30 seconds earlier, she's talking about shaking hands with Yasser Arafat. So you see the where she's coming from, right? One could argue that one of the greatest threats to the future of the Jewish people is extreme indifference to the behavior of terrorists, right? But she doesn't frame it like that.
30 years, Oslo died, Israel's left-wing parties disintegrated, peace with Palestinians fell off the agenda.
That's also just not true. The Israeli government made a number of attempts to have a peace agreement, whether that was Ehud Olmert, Ehud Barak, even Netanyahu's negotiation. Now, you might say that they weren't willing to make Oslo-like concessions, but to say that peace fell off the agenda is a lie.
The stain of occupation continues into its sixth decade. And
I have no idea what she's talking about. It's the stain of occupation. So you have a Palestinian opposition, of which, might I just add that the most recent Palestinian opinion poll published this week said that 53% of Palestinians thought, supported October 7th. So when we talk about the stain of occupation, why is it framed from that perspective? And is she truly apolitical when it comes to this discussion?
this year, Israel elected the most right-wing, ultra-religious government in its history, which quickly moved to weaken the independence of the judiciary, steamroll the rights of minorities, and mobilize a private militia.
Okay, I'm not even going to get into every single issue that she's bringing up here, but notice she is bringing up political issues. So you have a democratically elected government of the state of Israel that now the rabbi in Manhattan is targeting. And when you talk about people that accuse Jewish people and Jewish leaders of dual loyalty, Here you have someone who's taking time from their sermon on a Shabbat evening or morning, and they are going into lengthy discussions about the Israeli government and their position on the Israeli government, and as you'll see later, what to do about it. And when you talk about engaging in domestic American politics, it's not done in the same way. It's inviting accusations of dual loyalty and of a very strange precipitation. Excuse me. It's a very strange participation in the American civic experiment, because here you're becoming activists in a foreign government in a very strange way that if Israel were to do that in America, most Americans would say this is nuts.
In a matter of months, this new government has taken actions that threaten to turn Israel into an authoritarian, theocratic state that very few American Jews will be able to support.
And this rabbi is claiming to be apolitical? You might disagree with them, but first of all, you're speaking about this from the Bima. You're telling people that American Jews might not support this state anymore. What's up with that? Is this actually nonpartisan, apolitical leadership that's just a spiritual home? What if you're actually a member of this congregation and you support the government of Israel? Is this your spiritual home?
What a distance we have traveled in so little time. Of the 8 billion people in the world, Jews make up only 0.2%, just 15 million souls. Approximately 7 million of us live in Israel, and another 7 million live here in America. And there are only 1 million Jews everywhere else in the world. As in the time of the Second Temple period, which had 2 major Jewish centers, Israel and Babylon, the Jewish landscape of today also has 2 centers of Israel and America.
The egomaniacal way of approaching this is actually quite nauseating. You have a Jewish homeland, a Jewish state, and to equate that then with the American Jewish community, which is a nice community, but it's not another center. You might have people that participate in Jewish life, but to claim that it's a center on par with the actual Jewish state in the land of Israel is asinine.
But increasingly, these 2 Jewish communities do not understand each other. Most American Jews see our Judaism as inextricably linked with our ethical values of democracy.
Okay, first of all, most Israelis see their Jewish values as inextricably linked with their values, with their modern values, except that they believe that halacha or Torah is the center. Notice Angela Buchdahl is now going to go into a diatribe that has nothing to do with how traditional Jewish thinking views Jewish values.
Egalitarianism, pluralism.
But it's not that she's entitled to have this position. It's just a departure from the traditional Jewish thinking. And notice that the way in which she goes about the entire speech now is going to continue to harp on the fact that there's these 2 languages and that they don't understand each other, but it's looking at Israel and trying to tell Israelis how they should think, not perhaps the American Jewish leadership, certainly in the Reform movement, has moved increasingly far away from traditional Torah view of how things are done. So everything is attacking the other, being the Israelis, not actually perhaps looking inward for a half a second and saying, maybe there's something wrong with us.
American Jews know discrimination and bigotry And as little more than 2% of America's population, we are particularly sensitive to minority rights.
Parenthetically, there was something like 750,000 refugees from Arab lands after Israel was established. So when you talk about knowing a minority and knowing discrimination, I can't think of a population that would know that more than the Israelis, not to mention the fact that people that fled the Holocaust in Israel would know what it's like to be an ethnic minority.
When we hear Israel's government write off Reform Judaism as inauthentic, when ministers declare that a Palestinian village deserves to be wiped out, or proudly
agree or disagree with Bezalel Smotrich, whom she's quoting here, she's talking about Bezalel Smotrich and she's talking about ministers. So when you have a candidate to be the mayor of New York doing what Zohran Mamdani has done, you can call it out from the bima. That's just a fact.
affirm their homophobia in the name of Judaism. We recall the core charge we were raised with at our Seder tables: to be attuned to the outsider because we are that outsider. For most secular Israelis, however, their Judaism is deeply connected to their nationalism, inextricable from the very land they live on, serve, and protect. When attempts to implement Oslo led to Arab violence and the Second Intifada, Israelis paid the price with their lives. When Israel withdrew from Gaza in 2005, instead of calm, there was Hamas rule and rocket fire.
Being completely fair. Thank you, Angela Buchdahl, for stating a fact about Israeli withdrawal from Gaza and rocket fire. Kol hakavod.
Israelis couldn't comprehend how American Jews kept insisting on more withdrawal from territories as pathways to peace. They saw us as
also accurate,
naive, or worse, unconcerned for their security or safety.
Also, that's heightened self-awareness.
Our two biggest Jewish communities literally speak different languages. We understand Judaism differently, and the current moment is testing us like never before.
Notice that there's no judgment there, right? Maybe part of the problem is that some leaders don't understand Judaism properly or are politicizing Judaism in a way that shouldn't be done. I will add, I hate liars. So any observer in Israel will admit that the rabbinate in Israel has been politicized, and there are problems that come from that. I don't appreciate the lying when it comes on the American left, or you see from many leaders in the reform movement like Rick Jacobs, which actually downplay this. To me, that's just dishonest. And I will call out the right, I will call it the left. It doesn't matter. It's not whether I theologically agree with you or disagree with you. Just be honest with what you're doing.
The distance feels so great, we no longer remember what connects us. Does anything still bind Am Yisrael as one?
The Torah, Hashem.
This question might be best answered by a story from the Talmud. A rabbi was walking down the street and noticed a man with two heads and one body, what we call conjoined twins. Upon seeing this incredible sight, the rabbi wonders, does that man have to wrap two tefillin boxes, or is one sufficient? Because, well, that's what rabbis wonder about. The answer to his question comes from a midrash of King Solomon, who also encounters conjoined twins when they come to argue for a double portion of inheritance.
Again, I'm not going into specific interpretations of different stories. I'll let it run here.
Solomon has to decide, are they one person who happens to have two heads, or two people who have to share one body? King Solomon devises a test. Pour hot water on one of the heads, and if the other head screams out, well, then you know they are indeed one soul. Yes, this is a very cruel test. Remember, this is the same King Solomon who suggested cutting a baby in half to ascertain its true mother. But there is something quite profound in this teaching. If we want to test whether or not the Jewish people are still one body, we must see how one head responds to the suffering of the other. This is not a theoretical question right now. The Jews of Israel are crying out in pain. I saw this with my own eyes as I marched with hundreds of thousands of protesters in Tel Aviv and Jerusalem who've come onto the streets week after week.
Let's just say it's a very myopic view in the sense that just because you speak to a few people in Israel, or even a few dozen people in Israel, if they come from the same ideological persuasion, it does not mean that you're speaking to all of the people of Israel and that that's how they definitively think.
For over 8 months, who rally against this government while waving Israeli flags, singing Hatikva, because they protest in the name of their patriotism and their Zionism. I watched interviews with senior Israeli Air Force reservists who warned of a grave threat to Israel's security as thousands of Air Force and Army reservists refused to show up for duty as the first judicial reforms passed.
I think it was a mistake, but again, they're Israelis. So remember, we're talking about a foreign government. This is what she's talking about in her synagogue, but this is a foreign government. This has nothing to do with America.
Central heard directly the anguished voice of Rom Ohayon, the CEO of IGI, Israel's largest LGBTQ youth organization, who shared that her community is losing hope that they have a future in Israel. They're not alone. A recent Israeli poll reported that 1 in 4 Israelis is considering leaving the country. Even if an exodus of this scale is unlikely, the numbers themselves are a cry for help. Mati Friedman, Yossi.
A cry for help from whom? Within Israel, within the democratic process of Israel. What does this have to do with the Upper East Side or Midtown Manhattan?
Klein Halevi and Daniel Gordis, Israeli journalists who often interpret and defend Israel's actions for a mainstream Zionist audience, wrote an unprecedented open letter in the Times of Israel, pleading for American Jews to get involved before it's too late, saying, "The change is afoot will have dire consequences for the solidarity of Israel's society, and it will do grave damage to our relations with you."
I think this is frankly stupid. It shouldn't have been said. And just because a few writers in Israel say this doesn't mean that it's correct.
This is a moment for alarm. It's worth saying that there is also real pain on the other side of these protests. Mizrahi Jews who've been treated like second-class citizens ever since they arrived, younger voters who came of age in the shadow of the Second Intifada, uprooted settlers from Gaza who never saw the payoff promised to them for leaving their homes. Their pain showed up at the voting booth, and this government has mobilized a coalition of the aggrieved, which threatens to tear Israeli society apart with a force that even the government can no longer control. The other half of the Jewish world is in some very hot water. How will we respond?
So you're talking about a political issue in a foreign country of which Jews do care about, but it's a foreign country. And this is what you're talking about in your speech in Shul on Rosh Hashanah.
Micha Goodman, an Israeli public intellectual who spoke at Central last year, put this current moment in historical perspective when he related the curse of the 8th decade. You see, only 2 other times in Jewish history have we Jews had sovereignty over ourselves. The first Jewish state, established by King David 3,000 years ago, and the Hasmonean dynasty of the Second Temple period. In both instances, internal strife in the 8th decade, Jew against Jew, precipitated our downfall and destruction. Now, we seized a third opportunity for self-determination when the State of Israel was founded in 1948. But do the math. We are in the 8th decade. You don't have to be superstitious to believe that the curse of the 8th decade could strike again. And if Israel were to no longer exist, how would you feel? I want you for a moment to imagine it. A world without a Jewish homeland. Really, see how that sits in your heart and your soul. It should feel unthinkable and compel us to act. But I also know there are some of you, sadly, who don't feel compelled. To you, I urge, if you care about democratic rights, help preserve the only functional democracy in the Middle East. If you care about the vulnerable,
functional democracy in the Middle East, and here you have a rabbi in a different country encouraging people to get involved in the affairs of a foreign country to preserve their democracy.
Safeguard the sole sanctuary for Jewish refugees in need everywhere. If you value Jewish peoplehood, hear the cries of the other half of our Jewish family and remember the destiny of Am Yisrael is bound one to the other.
Also, it's not the other half. You see how the math just always gets completely ignored? You're talking about, even if you want to say 60% of Israelis didn't like judicial reform, that's not the entirety of all Jews in Israel. So when she says half, she's very fast and loose with these, with the math.
This young, messy, miraculous Jewish state is the most important sovereign democratic project of the Jewish people of the last 2,000 years. We cannot walk away. While the task can at times feel overwhelming and exhausting.
What task? You live in America. Okay, you want to be involved in certain projects, but to say the task of forming a democracy in Israel in which you have American people meddling in their domestic politics, I really don't understand it. And then, again, let's keep in mind, the reason I'm even talking about this is because Angela Buchdahl refused to come out and condemn Zohran Mamdani's anti-Semitism.
Pirkei Avot teaches, it's not our duty to complete it, only not to abandon it. We stand on the eve of another new year, Rosh Hashanah. Rosh means head, and Shana comes from the root to change. So this Rosh Hashanah, I'm asking this head, the American Jewish community, to change our approach to Israel in 3 ways. The first is to really listen to Israelis. Don't just get your news from the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal. Listen and read Israeli journalists. Put the Times of Israel podcast on your list.
I don't even know that Angela Buchdahl realizes how insane she sounds. Most Israelis do not listen or read the Times of Israel. They're actually listening or reading in Hebrew. And I know very few Israelis that actually listen to the Times of Israel podcast. So the echo chamber is so strong that I don't think she even realizes that she's promoting the echo chamber.
Come hear the speakers we will bring to Central. And
so the only authentic voices are really coming from Central. You understand they're creating a box. They're moving the Overton window in which their view of it is actually just the reality, and that's authentic. And when she says don't judge, how about you bring in people that don't agree with anything you do at Central Synagogue and have a discussion?
I know this is hard, but try to listen in order to understand, not to offer solutions.
The condescension is just insane. She just started by saying that there's a democratic project that people in Manhattan need to get involved in over 6,000 miles away, but you need to listen to understand, not to offer solutions.
Yes, this is exactly what I tell my husband when I talk to him. Often empathy is what we really need most. As Mati Friedman recently said on the Identity Crisis podcast, it sounds sentimental, but Israelis need to hear that you're with us. But things feel a little lonely over here sometimes. This December, Central is bringing our first congregational trip to Israel since the pandemic began. And in February, we are bringing our board of trustees because it is critical that the leadership of one of the largest American synagogues be in relationship with the people of Israel and hear them. Secondly, Reform Jews should give our support and money. Because here's the truth. Most American Jews have been under-supporting our values in Israel.
So it's not to support Israel as it is, but it's to promote your values from New York City in Israel.
If you want to see change, fortify the protesters, support the Israeli reform movement.
So now the best way to support Israel is to fund protesters as you're trying to strengthen the democracy of a foreign country.
Fund the NGOs and institutions that are building a more just, democratic, egalitarian, pluralistic Israel.
So again, she's saying don't come with solutions, but yet she's now saying that you have to fund NGOs and projects which Israelis may or may not want, and in the ballot box did not seem to really care about, but she's now saying this is what you have to do. Keep in mind, she refused to come out and say or condemn Zohran Mamdani's anti-Semitism.
This is not about trying to remake Israel in our American image. This is about helping Israel live up to its own foundational aspiration as stated in the Declaration of Independence as, quote, a country for the benefit of all its inhabitants.
Jews in Manhattan don't inhabit the state of Israel. So none of what she's saying makes any sense at all.
Based on the precepts of liberty, justice, and peace envisaged by the Hebrew prophets. That is an Israel worth fighting for and funding. Finally, Od lo avda tikvatenu, we must not give up hope. Giving into despair or remaining silent, these are acts of complicity in a time of
giving into despair. These are acts of complicity. So you have an actual anti-Semite running for mayor of New York, and silence is complicity when it comes to Israel, but not when it comes to New York City.
Moral urgency. And if you need a shot of optimism, look no further than these protests, which have stirred to action an estimated 7 million Israelis since January. From Likud to the left, from kippahs to the non-kosher. Only 11% of Israelis voted for the ultra-nationalist and ultra-religious parties that have hijacked the current government. The vast majority of Israelis want reforms, but also refuse to be governed by extremists, and they have not given up. Once again, in the streets of Israel, the central chant of protest, echoing years past, calls busha, shame. Busha for undermining the checks and balances of democracy. Busha for turning a blind eye to Jewish violence in Arab villages.
First of all, you also notice, I mean, I just remember this here when she says she participated in the protests. So people are asking her to stand up against Zohran Mamdani, who would actually be her mayor in New York, and she can't do that. But she can go to a foreign country. She can go to Israel and participate in a protest movement and encourage people to fund NGOs that are promoting specific agendas that she supports.
Busha for denying basic civil and human rights in the name of Judaism. Right now, there's
an actual anti-Semite running for the mayor of New York, and she hasn't said anything.
American Jewish and Israeli heads are crying out, Busha, shame. And that's good, because shame is a sign of moral clarity.
So she hasn't said anything about Zohran Mamdani. I don't think she's particularly shamed about it. So does she have moral clarity? That's a good question.
We feel shame when we recognize that we are not living up to our ideals. Rabbi Sharon Cohen Anisfeld, the president of Hebrew College, reminded me of the holiness of the Hebrew language when she recently taught that if you take the Hebrew root letters of Busha, Bet, Vav, Shin, and reverse them, they spell Shuv, return. It might be that our shared shame in this moment is exactly what enables us to return to each other and to our shared values. Shuv, that is our call for this new year. Now, the last time.
So the call in this new year in New York on Rosh Hashanah 2 years ago is to participate in a social protest movement in a foreign country in Israel. Make that make sense, especially given the fact that she says nothing about Zohran Mamdani.
Israel succumbed to the curse of the 8th decade, we made our final stand atop the desert stronghold of Masada. Those first-century Jews who took their own lives thought that this was the very end. And for 2,000 years, it was. But recently, Israeli scientists took ancient date seeds found in Masada's storerooms and miraculously germinated them, these fragments of the past, into blossoming date palm trees. Long ago, the psalmist had a vision, Tzadik katamar yifrach, that in our promised land, the righteous would flourish like date palms. We have not realized that promise yet. But I've met so many who nevertheless persist. As you all leave services tonight, we are giving you a jar of date honey made by Building Together, an inspiring cooperative of Israeli and Palestinian date farmers. As we dip our apples into this honey for the new year, may it connect us to the many righteous who are fighting for a more just, democratic, peaceful Israel every day. May it remind us that even a 2,000-year-old seed can bear new fruit. May its sweetness call us to return. Od lo avda tikvatenu. We have not given up hope that we are still one body, one beating heart, one Am Yisrael.
What does that have to do with, like, the conflation of Am Yisrael and being together as a Jewish people with, therefore, that gives Jews, regardless of where they live, the ability to interfere in democratic elections is obscene. Now take that forward to now what Angela Buchdahl's claiming about this election in New York City, where she cannot denounce open and blatant anti-Semitism. There is a political standard when it comes to Central Synagogue, and that is she will speak up if it's progressive left. And when it comes to anything that might violate those precepts, she is silent. And that silence speaks volumes.